Good afternoon, just about to everyone who has tuned in on this Thursday afternoon at the end of July. You're very welcome. You are, just to check, you are joining UWA's Public Policy Institute's online event in collaboration with Engineers Australia WA branch, dealing with the preparedness of the engineering profession for the challenge of climate change. My name is Shamit Sagar. I am the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute, and you're very welcome to this event. If I can, just before we go any further, start with the customary Noongar acknowledgement, if you will. The University of Western Australia acknowledges that the Whadjuk Noongar people are the traditional owners of the land on which its Crawley campus is situated. The Whadjuk Noongar remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. Therefore, on behalf of the university, I'm very pleased to pay my respects to their leaders and elders, past, present, and future. Thank you. Today's event is an important one for the Public Policy Institute, but can I just say a little bit about what the Institute does to those who are not familiar? We were set up in 2018, and in 2019, I was recruited to be the director. And we have a very important role to play in terms of making sure that the university's world-class research and world-class reputation in different research rankings is, as far as possible, utilized by those out there who are research users and practitioners. And that begins above all else with the people of Western Australia. Remember, a century ago, the university was principally set up by the founding fathers, as it were then, of the state, who thought about the university's role in terms of improving the lives of communities and people locally. And in that sense, our vision and strategy for the 2020s at the university is to go back to that original value to make sure that we are of value and significance to those surrounding us. The second thing about the Institute is to say a little bit about its work. And we have three major lines of work. One has to do with translational activities, taking the research that I mentioned and making sure that it is translated and fit for purpose to be used by government, by business, non-profits, campaign groups, and others. Secondly, we have a very important role in terms of ensuring that the capacity of our academics and our researchers is able to communicate and work with policymakers swiftly and effectively. I'll come back to that thought later on. And thirdly and lastly, where I think today's event sits more than anything else, has to do with thought leadership. That the Institute picks up key issues of our time and ensures that its contribution on behalf of the university is projected to as many audiences, senior and junior, as far as possible. And the challenge of climate change, it seems to me, is one such example of such thought leadership. So we would be doing this sort of event, it seems to me, in any case, but it was useful back in the summer of 2019 into 2020, when we had an approach from Engineers Australia, WA, to think about a prospective event of this kind. And I'm very pleased that a few months later, notwithstanding the destruction of COVID, we are here now finally hosting that event. As I mentioned earlier on, we've got a very large guest list, over 500 have registered. We're going to have a very wide-ranging discussion, albeit one that's condensed by the constraint of time. So I'm particularly keen to acknowledge the collaboration with Engineers Australia, David Rice, who came to see us following a prompt from my colleague in political science, Mark Beeson, who'd written a book at that time on environmental populism. That's some of the background to where we are. Very quickly, and time is very important, let me just say quickly a couple of things about the purpose of today's event. And I think it falls into three categories. The first is, without a doubt, from 2019 onwards, there has been something of significant change in the political and ideological climate in Australia and perhaps internationally. We see, as a result of the post-2019 bushfires, a significant change in the tone and measure of political campaigning and political dialogue here in Australia and possibly internationally. BHP's Andrew Mackenzie is a very good example of a business leader who sought to take the business community in the direction of embracing the challenges that flow from climate change. And elsewhere in the business and financial community, we have Ralph Hamers from ING, a major investor, a European investor, with over €1 billion under current investment, who sought to also embrace the question of how financiers would tackle climate change in terms of identifying key risks for the future. Secondly, I think today's event is meant to be part of a broad examination of how different professions will also be dealing with climate change. Today, we may be talking about engineers, for example, how they may be involved in developing heat-tolerant transport systems. Tomorrow, we may be talking with and alongside architects on the design of buildings and the lifestyle of people in those buildings. And the day after that, we may be talking with economists about the business models that firms use in order to anticipate the consumer behavior of customers in the future. All these, it seems to me, are different sides of a coin that have to do with the preparedness of different professions dealing with climate change. And thirdly and finally, and perhaps most importantly, this examination is brought to you in part by a university. I can think of no better example of a university thinking about climate change and preparedness in terms of its own discipline, its own professions, and as it were, looking out into the future. Earlier this month, we had a new Vice Chancellor here at the university take over, Amit Chakma, and his own commitment to a more student-centric university, UWA in the future, is a very good example, it seems to me, of thinking long and hard about the content and the dynamics of different disciplines and curricula and syllabus in order to make sure that the graduates we're producing in the future match the kind of societal, political, cultural and business challenges that would flow. And climate change is a very good example of precisely that. Now, we have a cast of many dealing with our discussion today. I'm not going to hold up that too much. Our facilitator, Doug, will take us through that in a moment. But if I can just briefly begin with a short introduction about Anas Ghodani, who's going to be providing our keynote address this afternoon. Anas, a good colleague of mine here at UWA, has, amongst the highlights of his long-standing career in engineering, the title of, first of all, being the Professor of Environmental Engineering here at UWA, where he leads the research group dealing with the Aquatic Ecology and Ecosystem Studies group. He's also, in addition, the Executive Director of the CRC for Water-Sensitive Cities, where he has significant operational and scientific leadership responsibilities. Can I now hand over to Anas to get the discussion going?
Thank you very much, Shamit, for that introduction. So I'm really pleased to be here to take part in this important conversation. As you may have heard, this is essentially a start of a dialogue that will go on, I'm sure, for a while. But before I go on, I want to add my acknowledgement of the country that we are on and pay my respect to the traditional owners. And I want to start by saying this. It's really interesting as an educator that we live in a time when we talk about climate change in our classrooms. We have to almost announce and give a trigger warning, because a number of our students are actually upset when they hear issues around climate change. And we have to really, start painting a comprehensive picture. And I would say a rather positive picture. So I'm going to say trigger warning to all of you here. We're going to be talking about a subject that upsets some, but I will try to paint it in as positive way as possible. And for that, I would like to share with you a vision. In preparing this talk has given me a lot to work on and work with. And it was really hard, I have to say, because, I can give you the PowerPoint deck by data. I can give you all sorts of pictures, but I wanted really to reflect on the role of engineers and start the conversation around a vision. So my personal vision is that the climate change challenges are going to be the stimulus for the renaissance of engineering. And I really want you, if you have like a piece of paper, just scribble on that vision, or just take your mind to an idea where these are challenges that are facing us. But as engineers, in an engineering community, engineer educators, we have a big role to play, but this is going to change the profession and it's going to actually allow us to go to the next level. So in my view, it's the renaissance of engineering. And I was looking up the renaissance for those of you millennials who may not have heard about this word. It's the renaissance is the age where we came out of the darkness into the light. So maybe here we are in a situation that we need to really look at us very seriously and see how the engineering that we do will impact the world, and will impact the world with all its challenges. So there's about 500 of you that are registered here. And if I look at the map of Australia, the political map of Australia, there is about 60% of these 500 who want some action on climate change. The other 40 are not interested. Now, of those 60% people, not all of them actually have voted for people who had something as part of their priorities around climate change. So we have to accept that as a nation, we're still divided on this issue in terms of action. But I'm going to tell you why, as engineers, you must take action at 100% level, because you kind of stuck. And I'm telling you, this is another thing. This is hashtag. Engineers are stuck in this situation in a many ways, but I think it's in a good way. So let me just introduce this part, this analogy here. So, and demystify the idea around climate action. So you may have heard of this word, climate action. So there are lots of people who view it as activism, okay? So that's one thing. But I was reading, actually, it's very interesting that there are lots of people who describe themselves as, you know, I found that there's climate deniers. And yes, in Australia, we have people who are in power who are actually climate deniers. There's climate optimists, there's climate pragmatists, there's climate activists, there's climate fighters, climate realists, climate opportunists, climate protectionists, climate warriors, climate quitters, angry antis. There's a whole bunch of picture. But as engineers, you must take action around climate change. And here is why. So let me just share with you some slides. So that was my acknowledgement to country. So climate change, an engineering perspective. I was thinking about it as well. I was like, oh, it's not just one perspective. There's many perspectives that we can think about. And that's why there's an invitation for all of you to think really about different ways that you can actually think about action around climate change. But here's an interesting one for engineers. So this is an important person in Australia, judge, a former judge who headed an important commission recently. This is one of his declarations that he did in 2019. So he's saying a sense of helplessness and a short-termism is no excuse for inaction on climate risk. And he was directing this exactly at the directors of companies, okay? Now, why engineers? Why does it matter for engineers? Well, there are many levels to this. There's a number of engineers who actually sit on boards and have those responsibilities to take action. Now, this is not just a commercial responsibility, but it's actually something that can land you in court. And I don't think for people who watch some of the exchanges that Justice Hayne had with people in the media, you can see that you don't want to find yourself, you know, facing this man, because he's pretty robust about these things. So you can find yourself actually brought to court, and that's exactly what he says. You can be brought to court for your responsibility. Now, the boards around the place are also very nervous when it comes to topics like this one. So I went to my colleague, a very highly respected leader in the area of catastrophic failure of mines, mine tailing dams. And he basically said that the climate change issues is exacerbating the problem. So we have to look not only at the design, but we look at also the boards of companies who are their main concern. And they are so nervous that when engineers present them with any design or criteria, their first instinct is to reject it. Because then what happens is that engineers find themselves doing more work, sometimes not, sometimes justified, sometimes not justified. So here you go. You have a place where people are nervous about these issues, and engineers are stuck to have to deal with those things. And I think it's an interesting point here because engineers, so the other expert that I went to is Chari. Chari, many of you know Chari. He's an expert in coastal engineering. And he showed me a piece of data that you can see here. And there is no doubt that there is issues around sea level that we have started to see the actual. This was in the press the other day where 1,600 dwellings, properties have been identified in Victoria as being subjected to inundation. So this is not something that people think about as in the future. The future is already here. But to illustrate, I'm a water person, so I wanted to bring the water story here. And I think there is a beautiful water story in Perth to be told that is really important for engineers. Now, there has been many, many water stories in Perth. So the main one that you know, that you probably know, the story of the pipeline that went to Kalgoorlie. And I don't think any engineer should actually claim to themselves that they are an engineer if they haven't traveled along the pipeline and understood how much of a beautiful engineering piece that project is and was. And is still operating with 38 pumping stations. So that's the other story. Let me tell you the most current story. I know of no data set in the world that is as beautiful as this data set that I'm presented you with. And why this data set? Because this data set has led the government of Western Australia to make some huge decisions. And I'm gonna point those to you. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this, this is not about rainfall. This is about the amount of water that gets into the dam. So you can see it from 1911. We used to receive 400 gigaliter. At some stage, don't worry about where the break happens because that's still debatable. At some stage that was halved, okay? You can see it here. It dropped and it was halved. And at some stage in the early 2000s, it was halved again, and then halved again. So that left the community with the decision. What do you do? Because you're running out of water. There is no doubt. You can look at it, whatever way you look at it, there was no water and it's getting drier and drier. And this is a perfect picture of what climate change can do to you. Now, I know that over East, they're still debating about, is it a dam? Is it desalination? Is it there? But look at the data set and look at what the data tells you. So the first thing that the government of Western Australia did is they called on engineers. They were like, we need an engineering decision, an engineering project. And this is what happened. There was the Perth desalination plant that was built. Marvelous, amazing engineering project. It basically gave us all that security that we needed at the time. And I had just arrived to Perth actually at that time, to early time of the conversation. Then we went with another project of another desalination. And now we're doing this groundwater replenishment. Now, why am I pointing out to these three things? Because they are one big, every one of them is one big, typical traditional engineering project. You give me a problem, I'll give you a solution. This is what it is. It's a one-off thing, right? And it solves the problem. Now, can we continue to do that? The problem is we can't continue that. This is when the engineers gets double stuck because you can't be allowed anymore to just do that big engineering decisions. You have to take into that big engineering solution. You have to take into account the social, the political, the environment, the economy, the technology, the whole lot. So when the Water Corporation, for example, did a big survey of 5,000 customers, a lot of customers were concerned about the environment. And they were talking about the fact that, yes, we need water security, but not at the cost of this. We don't want this, and we want technology, and we don't want this kind of technology. So the debate has become more comprehensive, and the role of engineering has changed as a result of that, because we have to respond to a lot of considerations, and that's really exciting, but at the same time, it's really hard. So let me just tell you one thing. This is something that I tell my students. I say, okay, if I draw a big circle around Australia, I'm gonna hit countries that pay engineers the fifth. So I can, for the salary of an engineer in Australia, I can get 5 engineers in that big circle around us. So why would I hire an engineer at 5 times the price? And the answer here is that the problems are getting more complex, more comprehensive, that you need a lot more integration to deal with those things than just the simple engineering solution problems. So climate change is throwing this big challenge to us. And the way I was pleased to see that the Australian Council of Engineering Deans had just released a sort of a framework that basically spells this idea here that the past of engineering is about technical, specialist, problem definition, problem solving, analysis, design, reliable, accurate. So if you're a company and you're still marketing yourself here, you are already in the past. You are 2000 and late. Where you need to be and where we need to be collectively is in this area here. Future engineering work is more complexity, multidimensional, multidisciplinarity, greater public accountability, greater social engagement. The pub test, things that we do need to pass the pub test. And I'll tell you about the pub test in a minute. So technical expertise, these are the things that we can have 5 engineers around here for the price of 1. But you need the emotional intelligence, the digital intelligence, the personal skills, the ethical. Please don't call them soft skills. They are not. They are the important things, because those are the ones that are going to get us to solve those big issues like climate change. And many of you have seen what the bushfires have done to Australia. I was devastated. Any engineer who would see a city, a town that is cut off from land, from air, from sea. There were places with no water to fight the fire. And I really honestly didn't need this guy, because the bushfire had already gave us more problems. Then COVID hit. And then engineers now need to think about better ways to tackle these big challenges. And climate change is just one of them. So let us all together think about the renaissance of engineering and think about some of the big questions. How can we bring society together? And regardless who you vote for, because that's a risk, but that's a sort of a legal responsibility you have as an engineer to take some action, as opposed to your personal views and political arguments, whether you believe in things or not, is really irrelevant. You can express those at the ballot box. And that's where the policy is really important. But as an engineer, you have professionally to address those issues, and to address them as I pictured you throughout this thing, is to address them not in a way you want, by building desalination, in a way that the people want. So, you know, the people that go to the pub have much different expectation than it used to be. The future, I think, is amazing. So for those of you who are depressed by talking about climate change, I can guarantee you that we can do a lot, and there's a lot that we can do together. Engineers will have to be at the driving seat for this one. Thank you so much.
Anas, thank you very much. On that preparedness account, can I just swiftly turn to my colleague, Doug Abel, who's now going to take over the facilitation of this event. Doug is from the College of Leadership and Management. The way we're going to run this is he's going to speak a little bit about his role in Engineers Australia, and then he's going to swiftly move towards the panel who will be responding both to what Anas has been saying earlier on, but also to the interaction with our audience and Q&A. But let me not hold the space. Doug, over to you.
Thanks, Shamit, and thanks, Anas. As Shamit foreshadowed, we're going to have a discussion now with input after Anas's keynote from 4 speakers. They'll speak for about 5 to 7 minutes each. There's a very large number of you in the audience, and I want to say at the outset that every question that you post on the Q&A bar, which is the only place to do it, will be captured, and we'll be using that to fuel a future event where we'll burrow in and examine a lot of the questions and comments in more detail. Today's really a fishing expedition and a taster as much as anything. So please post your questions on the Q&A bar. We'll be using the chat to curate those questions and pass them across so that we deal with a sample of them today. And we will be honouring every one of them as we formulate an event in the future. So yeah, Shamit's already pointed out, I'm from the Centre for Engineering Leadership and Management here at Engineers in Australia and WA. And I'm very happy to be part of the process. I'm going to throw to each of the 4 speakers in turn with a brief introduction, assuming that you've read their background. And then we'll go to the questions that you've posted as you're listening. And once again, if you can put them on the Q&A bar, that would be really helpful. Our next speaker is actually Gillian Formington. She's currently the president of the WA division of Engineers Australia. And she's a chartered fellow of Engineers Australia. She has a real interest in risk management and minimising business and personal risk exposure, and has a particular interest in safety and environmental responsibility. She believes that sustainability comes with the capacity to be successful in varying conditions, going beyond simply stopping bad things from happening and allowing people, importantly, to authentically create sustainable performance. And there are echoes of what we heard from Anas there. So Gillian, over to you.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much for those kind words, Doug. And I am also very proud to be part of this event on behalf of Engineers Australia. So thank you everybody for joining us. I'm offering a risk management view in this conversation. In fact, some of us may even call it a risk leadership approach to the conversation. And it's a bit of an invitation also for all of us about how we're engaging in this conversation. So for those of you who do know me well, and there's probably a couple of you out there, you'd know that I've worked with thousands of people here in Western Australia as well as overseas to overcome like previously intractable issues. So some of the kind of issues that we say are impossible in industry, issues of safety, issues of cultural development, issues of like workers thriving. And some of those learnings I'm bringing to this conversation today. And you know, my commitment is that we can go beyond what we see as possible through to what could really be possible from the collective view. All right, so the kind of perspective I want us to look from is we want to consider that human beings, particularly committed human beings and people who are really committed to fulfilling on important issues in the world, one of the things that can happen is that we want to contribute our knowledge. We want to make a difference. We want to bring our view, and some of us are very passionate about the view that we bring. I invite you to include in this conversation a perspective of curiosity. Because what can happen is if we come from our specific view, it may be completely accurate. We might be spot on. Our science might be right. Our research might be right. Our experience might give us completely the view where we want to contribute that. However, if we're not considering all views, we may be like these 2 characters here, where we're only contributing what we can see. So you can see in this picture, to be able to really to see the fuller opportunity of what there is, you would actually have to walk around to the other side. So a 6 can become a 9. I mean, this is obviously very simple compared to the issues that we're dealing with in this conversation, but it can be that simple in terms of the way that human beings can relate to each other if they're coming from a fixed perspective. So instead, let's consider that there's an opportunity here to be curious together, to consider what there is still available to discover. Because most of us, we will be considering from the view of the things that we know, like we want to contribute what we know. That's the green part on that diagram. And then there are the things that we realize that we don't know. And I don't know if you're like me, we spend a lot of time to get the things that we don't know into the area that we do know. And that's what we, like that's how we work in traditional learning. We want to increase what we know and reduce the things that we don't know. But the opportunity here is, of course, there's a whole rest of the circle here, the things that we don't realize that we don't know. Now, sometimes those are in the area of science. We uncover things that were previously unknown. But sometimes the things that we don't know are the limitations to our curiosity or the limitations to our thinking. And, this is where the breakthroughs happen. The breakthroughs happen in the yellow part of the circle, where we discover that there are ways of approaching things that we haven't even realized that we're missing. And I like to think of it as kind of scratching a window open into that whole world. Now, this is the streetlight effect. Some of you may have heard of this before, and this whole what we don't know that we don't know, it's the beginning of what we know of as the biases, our listening biases. So how this story went was I think it was back in the old England days, and there was a man on the ground, and he was looking around under a streetlight for something, and someone else came along and said, "Hey mate, are you okay? What are you what's the problem?" He said, "Oh, I've dropped my keys." And he said, "Oh, okay. Where did you drop them here under the light?" And he said, "No, I think I dropped them over there, but I can see here, so that's where I'm going to look." So often we as people, in groups, individuals and whole communities, we get caught up in looking simply where we can see rather than looking where the answers might be that are out of our view. So that's a nice little analogy that reminds me to maybe with the key that I'm looking for is not where the light's shining. And I just want to end last with this a quick introduction into adaptive and technical challenges. So the difference between a technical challenge and an adaptive challenge. So a technical challenge is easy to identify. It's often quick solutions, can be solved by experts or authority. It can just take 1 or 2 changes. It's an either-or way of thinking, and solutions can be implemented quickly. And an example I've got there is, if you have high blood pressure, take medication. That's a technical solution. An adaptive solution is usually difficult to identify. Climate change fits all of these, requires changes in values and beliefs, the way people are approaching it. People who have the problem do the solving of it, so this is definitely a problem for society. Lots of changes included. It also takes a both and thinking. It's not black and white. This is a very complex issue. And there are new discoveries and skills that take a long time to happen sometimes. The solution is found from shifts in paradigm, shift in mindset, shift in culture. And a simple example is, to the blood pressure problem, might be to exercise, eat right, and be stress-free. Obviously more challenging and a harder thing to do. So a short chart that shows how this can progress. A technical problem you can see here, like this side here, the disequilibrium that happens on the left, where it's often urgent things need to be changed, and a technical solution can be done by fixing a couple of things, and then here we can see the relief happens quite quickly. The other line is more the pathway of what happens when we have to adapt and learn. And our job as people who are really committed to fulfilling on these long-term changes is to keep sufficient tension so that the issues can be dealt with. Now, it doesn't mean we want things to go so crazy and so uncomfortable that people give up. There's like a limit of tolerance, but we can actually keep the issues inside this bar until there's a threshold of change and some challenges. Then the relief might come once we've been able to apply some of these solutions. So that's what I want to leave you with. I hope I've left you with more questions than answered and somewhere to look from in this important conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. And to keep things moving, we'll swing back now to Shamit. We've already heard from Shamit, and we know he's the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute and professor of public policy. He actually has a very distinguished pedigree in the social science space, having been awarded a CBE in 2017 for his services to social science and public policy. And that's included senior advisor roles to people like the Prime Minister and the UK Cabinet, and also the Commonwealth Secretariat and House of Commons Speakers Conference. So Shamit, back to you for your perspective, please.
Thank you very much, Doug. Look, I'm going to speak fairly briefly because I'm sure that time will slip away in our session, our discussion. Look, two big telegraph points, if I can make these. The first is it kind of flows on from what Anas and Jill was saying. And I think the sort of big macro question here is not only how do institutions change, how do professions change, but how do we sort of account for change of the kind that is being sort of heralded and anticipated in the comments that have come so far. And it strikes me that when you look at the literature on change in professions and disciplines, there tends to be sort of 3 or 4 things that crop up on a recurring basis. The first is compulsion. Professions can be required to change. External pressure can be brought to bear in order to make sure that professions are, as it were, more relevant, more compliant, more up to date. And I don't think we're talking about that sort of discussion here, but that's worth sort of flagging up. The second is that professions sometimes say, well, we can only change if we have enough advice and information. We need to educate our members. We need to, as it were, know more about the kind of change, the rationale for change. And I think that discussion is going on in this space right now. Thirdly, sometimes professions change because of crisis. I think of the discipline, by the way, particularly of economics, and my colleagues in the field of economic science, who after the great financial crisis, the GFC of 2008, in many cases had to sort of go back and rethink from first principles many of the aspects of economics that they were researching, but ultimately also teaching younger minds. So I think crisis is not to be sort of ruled out. You don't want a profession that's not fit for purpose 5 or 10 years from now. And then lastly, professions also change when leaders have an important role to play, leaders who anticipate where they think either the public debate is going or indeed the requirements of new minds and new students. I mentioned, for example, key leaders in international investment, but also from the minerals sector here in Australia, the mining sector, in my opening comments. These are clearly leaders who believe that they need to carry, as it were, their peer group, their cohort with them. Now, with that in mind, I've spent a bit of time looking at other professions and how they're responding to aspects of climate change. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the actuaries and particularly the insurance sector. And I could just share with the audience 2 or 3 different reasons why it's important for the actuaries, who are unrelated, obviously, to the world of engineers, but in some respects is related, given what Anas was saying about interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ways of working in the future. And they have come across something of a consensus internationally to say what they do matters for the following reasons. First of all, let's remember that they are in the business of measuring and pricing risk effectively and accurately on behalf of different clients. So think of the direct impact of an actuary who has to face the challenge of the likelihood of a payout against an insurance contract. Now that rather depends upon probabilities. So if the probability of climate change impacts is going to rise in some regard, actuaries need to adjust their models in order to make sure that firms and household risks are properly reflected in the contracts that are written in the future. That's direct. Indirectly, it may well be that the investment decisions that they're advising upon also have an important impact. So insurance and life firms invest in the traded stock of other firms in order to make a return to pension holders in particular. Those firms in turn can have climate-related risks, and those in turn can result in what we would call the potential or the risk of stranded assets. Firms have made investment decisions which no longer account for the change in the environment around them. So investors would want to know that, and I'll talk about a practical example in a moment. And then lastly, not to be ruled out, given the large public spending impacts of COVID-19, sometimes governments are drawn into this when they have to mitigate and prevent a particular harm. And the public spending impacts of climate change are really quite colossal. COVID-19 is clearly something of a dress rehearsal when we think about the kind of public spending implications. The reason why that matters is that markets in turn have to have confidence in government's ability to repay whatever they are borrowing in international financial markets. If they lose that confidence, it has a direct bearing upon the pricing of money in the future, what they've lent. And so we as taxpayers have to either allow for a little bit more inflation to erode the level of that borrowing, or a higher level of taxation. So all these things are the sort of nuts and bolts, the day-to-day guts of being an actuary dealing with climate change. Very, very quick, tiny example, time is going to slip out, as I said. We could do a lot worse and look at the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Sorry, a horrible mouthful, happy to circulate it afterwards. When in 2017, they brought about a voluntary regime of disclosures. Why? Because they want to make sure that the actuaries who in turn advise firms in their investment decisions are able to provide good quality information to investors, lenders, insurers, and other stakeholders. Remember their core responsibility to accurately price risk for whoever the client might be, directly and indirectly. And the result of that seems to me we could do a lot worse than looking at the learning and take-up that's resulted in that task force's own knowledge hub, which many other professions could easily, it seemed to me, replicate if there's enough political and leadership will from below. Happy to expand on this all, Doug, in the discussion, but I just wanted to share these sort of telegraph points, partly in response to what was being said earlier on. I'll leave it there.
Makes sense. Thanks very much, Shannon, and we will come back. Without further ado, that's David Rice. He's a Fellow of Engineers Australia, and he's a retired civil engineer, done a lot of work in the transport space, where he first got interested in the issues we're talking about, and he's a sustainability advocate now with a particular focus on taking care of the future for his grandchildren. Over to you, David.
So we're looking at engineering design parameters, designed for future climate using systems thinking and enhanced leadership. So what future climate? Last year's report by the International Panel on Climate Change includes this chart of risks of global warming to humans and ecosystems. The white at the bottom indicates no risk, and the purple at the top, very high risk. The temperatures are on the left-hand side, and this is where we are now at 1 degree global warming. This is where we will be at the end of the century, a mean of 1.6 degrees, if humans can make massive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which on current indications we will not. And this red mean of 4.3 degrees is where we will be if we continue business as usual. But thankfully, there are indications that we should be able to improve on this. These shades show the likely temperature ranges around the means. And somewhere in here is what we need to adapt to. And I'm suggesting 2.5 degrees Celsius becomes an adaptation standard, and that's our first parameter. The beauty is that Australia can choose an adaptation standard whether or not the rest of the world does. Note, this is for end of century conditions, which the IPCC says can arrive between 2081 and 2100. Hence, in the text there, the next 60 to 80 years shown, which is not long in terms of major infrastructure. So what would these conditions look like? Longer and hotter heat waves plus increasing severity of bushfires. We might want to talk about the engineering needs of such things like reliable power, water and communication in the panel session, or rising sea levels in the Canal Estates of Mandurah, or around Sydney Airport. We also need a mitigation standard, and shown here is the Paris mitigation target of below 2 and preferably not more than 1.5. This is a global requirement and it's outside Australia's direct control, but definitely in our interest to promote because of our national vulnerability, and because much higher, say 3 degrees, will be catastrophic to most countries, including Australia. On a more positive note, Engineers Australia, this implements sustainability principles and practice, which I recommend people have a look at, includes a rating of regenerative, the top dark green. Regenerative means ending up at least 1.5 times better economically, socially, and environmentally than before, compared to sustainable, which can be the same or just a little bit better economically, socially, and environmentally. So our last parameter is regeneration, such as actual removal of carbon dioxide or plastic pollution or regeneration of vegetation. But the beauty of this again is that we can do it within Australia and even as engineers within our own projects. But we also need systems awareness to understand the bigger picture, awareness of where we are scientifically. That small pale blue dot floating in space is where we are literally. It is our planet Earth. That is irrefutable. Where we are conceptually is more debatable. Engineers Australia uses this systems concept to show the interdependency between the 3 elements of sustainability. The economy is a social construct. It's important, but it's not the sole goal. Society consists of humans, and humans are one of over 2 million known species. And all of this is totally dependent upon our environment. The economy and society are open systems, which means that bushfires in the environment impact on society and the economy. COVID impacts on the economy, and pollution from the economy impacts on society and on the environment. But it all stays somewhere within the environment, because the environment is a closed system, at least to the products of most human activities, which we need to explain to economists who are taught that things like pollution go into an imaginary grey space that they call externalities. Which brings us to leadership. The modern economy has provided huge benefits to humanity. Us engineers are key facilitators. We sometimes forget that, but we are key facilitators of the economy. And we're happy to claim kudos. Think clean water and sewerage saving the lives of millions of people. But the economy is also the most destructive force on Earth. And us engineers as key facilitators, we need to accept some of this responsibility. And that means serious leadership. Leadership for regenerating our sick planet, or at least the damaged parts of Australia. So in summary, we've talked about these things, and I want to end with a quick analogy of global warming with COVID, of adaptation as being the equivalent of personal protection equipment, of mitigation being the all-important vaccination against runaway global warming, and of regeneration being the path back to some sort of normal. Where systems thinking is used as a form of epidemiology, and the big question I will leave you with is, can our engineering profession provide the same proactive standard of leadership as the medicos? Is this a possibility for a renaissance of engineering? Back to you, Doug.
Thanks, David. And that was well worth the wait. So thank you. Can we go now to our last speaker, and that's Parisa Bari. Parisa's Professor of Engineering at Murdoch, and she's been there since 1977, having graduated with a PhD in Chemical Engineering from Sydney in 1995. In the time at Murdoch, she's occupied several leadership positions in the engineering faculty and more broadly in the university. And she's a fellow of Engineers Australia and a member of the National Committee on Automation, Control and Instrumentation, with her perspective from an educational point of view. Parisa, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which Murdoch University stands. And thank you for giving the opportunity for me just to touch base on the education perspective into climate change and its challenges. So looking at the education, and we want to see what the impact of climate change is on engineering and engineering profession, which the previous speakers have well spoken about it, the skills requirement and the education required. Obviously, climate change is a wicked problem. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. We know the science is complex, but at the same time, it's very straightforward, easy to understand what is happening to our planet. It is very easy to understand that there are interactions between different disciplines when it comes into climate change. It's not just science, it's not just engineering. It takes a lot of efforts from economists, social scientists, policymakers, lawyers, and so on to tackle the problem. If you look at the GHG emissions reported in 2010, we see the several sectors contributing to the climate change and the issues and the greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And looking at all these sectors and also the solutions that need to be provided into all these sectors in order to tackle the climate change issues, we see that actually engineers sit in the middle. Engineering touches every aspect of the human life these days, and therefore they are very important. Their role is quite important, as previous speakers also spoke about it. Engineers are in the center of both the problem and the solution. So the systems that we've designed, we've been educated to design, actually they contributed to the climate change, no doubt about it. But then we are the ones who pretty much sit in the center of devising the solutions to actually combat the environmental issues. As spoken by the previous speaker, and also to achieve the sustainable development goals, which was the backdrop of our plenary speaker. We bring lots of qualities into this picture. Engineers are able to work in teams. They bring in their analytical skills, their problem-solving capabilities. More importantly, they can bring the core engineering principles, but then implement it in different contexts and in different parts of the world. And it's one of the unique characteristics of engineers. And what we want to see, we've seen to some extent, but we would like to see more of that, is that engineers be able to interact with other professions, with the policymakers, with managers, lawyers, scientists, and economists. We need to be able to influence the decision makers. Now, talking about education, not just educating the engineers, actually, in my view, education is one of the key factors. We need to prepare societies to handle the climate change issues. The climate change education is one of the instruments, a key instrument actually, that should be employed to create an informed society, knowledgeable workforce, and enable government officials and decision makers to make decisions to prepare, to help protect the environment and hence our communities. The education needs to start from primary level. It's not a task of higher education. If it starts from primary level, it goes into every discipline within the society, not just engineering, not just scientists. But nevertheless, higher education institutions have a critical role in preparing society to adapt to the impacts of climate change, help local communities to actually create, test, disseminate knowledge. And that brings about the role of the engineering educators. They need to have the knowledge and also need to be knowledgeable of the fact that climate change is really no longer the concern of just radical environmental groups. It's a well-admitted priority of national and international, not only engineering organizations, but the communities. And especially when it comes into engineered systems. So we should be able to prepare the engineering students to enter the marketplace, to take leadership roles early in their careers, actually, not when they become managers, and push forward thinking about and tackling the challenges that the climate change actually poses to this planet. Now, when it comes to engineering education, in my view, it's not just the technical competencies, but what is now regarded in the literature as sustainability competencies, and that's partly was also brought forward by one of the speakers, that there are 6 competencies, sustainability competencies, that now appear in the literature, right from systems thinking, interdisciplinarity and diversity, right to strategic management. And we have to put a large focus on these competencies alongside the technical competencies when it comes into engineering education. It's not an easy task. It takes time and perhaps several different pathways. And this is my last slide, and is not one solution fits all. Maybe we need to look into different solutions when it comes into educating what is regarded as climate resilient engineers. We might be looking at creating innovative courses simply focusing on elements of climate change, such as environmental engineering, sustainable systems engineering, renewable energy engineering, oceans engineering. These are some of the courses which now exist across different universities. Not all students are tuned towards very niche areas of engineering such as these. Another option could be creating some electives or optional subjects within traditional engineering courses, such as life cycle assessments in a chemical engineering or mechanical engineering course, or energy efficiency, sustainable systems, and so on. These are all good material, but somehow students may see or find it difficult to actually make linkages between their core engineering subjects and these ones. Another option, which in my view, and that's my humble opinion, that might work really well is actually to integrate very deeply those sustainability competencies into our core engineering subjects, introducing those as good examples, projects, and really integrate that within whatever we teach under each of our traditional courses, making students think about the consequences of the systems that they design and the repercussions of that. And with that, I leave it here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Parisa, and thanks to all of you. I'd now like to move to a panel discussion, and I'm watching the questions as they come through on the chat. I'd like to put a question for all of you to respond to, because there is a steady theme that's woven through all of it. Some of it connects to what Parisa was just talking about, and that is the process not just of educating engineers, but rather of educating all of society. There are people who make legitimate observations in their questions about big engineering project decisions are largely made by non-engineers. Governments have a large impact on where we put our investments and our responses. So what I'd invite you to reflect on a little further is, how do we extend that process? How do we bring everyone in society along for the awareness ride, if I can put it that way, to have sufficient knowledge to be able to support the kind of responses that are needed?
I was just going to jump in, Doug. So I think it's a great question, and I was listening very carefully to Parissa, and I cannot be the only one who was struck by the sort of general drift, the line of her argument, which I think was very persuasive, to the effect that, in a sense, you can deal with the kind of core periphery issues of what engineers are being taught in universities. That's one part of it. But then you have to think a little bit about how undergraduates are going to be taught across the board. And I thought the drift of that argument ended up in sort of saying, could there be some sort of common knowledge that university students would be sort of exposed to, regardless of the discipline or field they've been recruited into joining the university in the first place? Now, that actually is not a new idea. Many universities all over the world have sort of experimented or toyed with some aspect of that. You know, over a decade ago, I was at Yale, and we found all the undergraduates, we sort of redesigned this, so they kind of had a kind of globalization 101 course put in front of them, where they were learning about the interconnectivity of different societies, economies, cultures, and so on. And that was then reflected in quite a lot of the ambition of the university to drive the debate, to accelerate and embed globalization. I know that sounds sort of kind of dated in the context of the COVID crisis, but that's actually a real example of a university that did precisely that kind of thing in the name of a different objective. So I'm just making the point that I thought the drift of our argument was pushing us in that direction. And that then places a significant responsibility upon academic leaders in UWA, Murdoch, and so on and so forth, to sit down, you know, eminent deans of X, Y, and Z, and think about what that common literature, what that common knowledge might look like. I think, you know, to my mind come my colleagues who would, you know, particularly social scientists, would have something to say upon all of that. But I think it would be a very exciting thing to do. I can't imagine what the process would look like, but I make the point that that would do some of the heavy lifting in terms of resulting in freshly minted graduates from this university and others who would have a common awareness about both the scientific dimension of climate change, but also the societal responsibilities that arise regardless of which discipline they're sat within. I put it no stronger than that. I'm really quite persuaded by that argument.
That's pretty strongly put. That was subtle, suggesting it wasn't strong. Well done. And it's actually very consistent with the question that's just come in. How about teaching climate change effect to other schools, e.g. economic, political, and so on? I think that's a valid point. But I'm interested in the perspective of Gillian on that question as well, in terms of bringing everyone along on the journey.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. It is, I certainly agree with what Shamet is saying as well. It's an issue of social responsibility, but I think somewhere where we can look from is often, particularly with an important issue like this, we look from what we can agree on. Now, this is multifaceted. There's so many different issues, and just about every group that gets together about this important issue are looking to agree, but they've got very different points of view. I think we need to shift our conversations to be more of aligning on where we have similar approaches and aligning on what are the right actions to take. It's a very different conversation to be in, you know, kind of battling to have your view heard, rather than looking together at what would be some common interest in this. And I think it won't be until then when, you know, all the different disciplines in the world, I mean, of course, engineering is a very, very important part of the solutions for this, but we're not the only voice. And the more that we can shape our leadership to have aligning conversations and conversations for aligned action, I think we'll be able to see more traction in moving towards the solutions that are going to be needed.
Thank you. David, are you?
Okay, so you can see the old idea and the new idea there of flat Earth and orbiting Earth. And then if we go to the next one, what we've been talking about is the notion of massive Earth versus finite Earth. And lastly, something like accounting thinking versus interdependent and regenerative systems thinking. So I think they're not engineering views, they're world views. And that's
Well,
what
there are engineering views which are also world views.
Yes, yes. So that's the point that I'm trying to make, and is that, well, as engineers, we talk about needing educated and all of the maths and physics and so on, but as engineers, can we also become educators in these wider worldviews and getting together with other professions? I'm particularly interested in economists, but obviously policymakers, if we can get them to agree. But I think also organisations like Engineers Australia, we've got a wonderful opportunity because we've got 100,000 members, and we can actually do quite a lot on the ground, literally, working from the bottom up. So if there was enough of us working from the bottom up and also working in multidisciplinary teams, influencing the colleagues alongside whom we work, then we can make a significant change.
Thanks, thanks, David. I'm going to come back to the comment you made about working from the bottom up because it's consistent with a couple of questions that have come in. But let me just invite Anas also to comment on that question about bringing everyone along in terms of sufficient knowledge to be making the community level decisions that we need.
Yeah, I think I would go a little bit. I think when we talk to especially our young engineers and students, they appreciate all these subtleties and how you have to change standards and do this, but they don't think of it as radical enough. So I think we need to go a little bit further. And I started by saying that there is a risk that you will be brought in front of the court if you don't do the right thing. So regardless what your government thinks. So I think this is an invitation for a broader dialogue. This is not just, and I agree with everyone, this is not just an engineering conversation. It's an engineering and all other professions conversation on how engineers can basically position themselves at the forefront of the solution. That's why I call for a renaissance.
Yes. Someone has actually asked if the Renaissance really happened. I'm not sure, but I'm aware that it wasn't moving into the light, but rather the light was already there and people just were willing to acknowledge it.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's starting. I think there's a greater awareness, but you look at the issues around catastrophic failure of mine tailing, and you can understand that if you go from the horizontal vertical, there's a lot of education to be done. Not just people on site, there's a whole series of things. And a project that Andy Forey at UW is just starting about future tales is really an example of an education piece that goes from all the way from the bottom to the top, including advising the boards, including educating the boards. Like boards get education in terms of finances, responsibility, and all of that. The next step is to get actually the boards to be more aware and to be more educated about the risks. So Gillian, I agree with you that matrix of risk and that awareness and greatest education at various levels is extremely, extremely important.
Thank you. One question that actually extends from what a few of you have said. A couple of people have alluded to the fact that people may come out educated and then feel somewhat disempowered low in the ranks of engineering, and they're asking, what can I do within my business to influence? What are the options that I have to influence thinking? And I'm interested in how people might like to respond to that. Perhaps back to you, Shamit.
Well, I mean, I go back to the comment I made right at the start about how institutions and organizations change. And I suspect, I mean, my greatest worry, of course, is that engineers, or indeed any other discipline we happen to be discussing, and climate change ends up being sort of seen as being not fit for purpose. And you would only need sort of a couple of significant climate-related tragedies or crises to take place internationally. I put no scale on that, in order for public attitudes to start to shift quite dramatically in favor of looking for some responsibility on the part of either engineers or indeed another profession. This is a key thing. And so I'll come back to the question in a moment, but a light version of this was experienced by the economists after the GFC. And the eminent Department of Economics at the great University of Manchester in the country from which I hail sat down and divided itself. Economists divided amongst themselves as to the extent to which they wanted to redraft, rethink the curriculum, the principles upon which economic science was taught to their students. Now, I think it's kind of a good thing that that happened, but you can kind of learn profitably and lightly if you're an engineer about what that would look like in this context. So to go back to the question that was asked, what difference can I make? It's about thinking about, you know, interventions that prevent that sort of first order crisis as a profession being no longer seen fit for purpose. The biggest challenge one has for any profession, and for that matter for politicians and business, is not primarily what we do, but it's a reputational failure. That reputationally, I mean, I think Australia is a very good example. Engineers are closely associated with the nature of our resources economy in this country. This is really in contrast to many other countries in the world. And if the resource companies were to badly play their hand in terms of taking risks or not sufficiently pricing or thinking about the risks they're taking, it's inconceivable that the engineers wouldn't be dragged into it, in my view. So that's a kind of way of looking at it. And the interventions are designed to avoid that kind of reputational risk, if that's helpful.
Yeah. Can I comment on that, Doug?
Well,
Okay, so what can I do? If I'm a doctor and we're in COVID, I can listen to the scientists, and then I can do two things, basically. One, I can treat some people, and two, I can influence the policymakers. But I become a sort of conduit between the science and the policy, or the science and what's on the ground. As engineers, we can do exactly the same thing. We're actually in a very powerful position, because I know from my experience, I can make quite a lot of relatively small decisions that nobody else is going to change, and yet they're either improving the environment or improving the climate or not. So I can do a lot at the day-to-day professional level. I just think that engineers as a profession, we need to get into the role of the doctors, like Engineers Australia or some other organisations, becoming really strong conduits to the government in talking about this thing, because climate change is going to be a lot more dramatic than COVID. I mean, COVID is really a pretty benign dry run, and in some ways a very useful dry run, because we've seen the importance of social health relative to the economy. So yes, I think we need to feel empowered, and we need to accept that we have got a lot of responsibility.
thanks, Parisa. Can I swing back to you for a comment on how we get naturally sustainable practices or processes built in to the way we think, rather than tacked on? I'm reflecting a couple of questions that have come in from that perspective, and looking particularly at where we start to educate people. While you're answering that, can I ask the rest of you to think about the next question, which is about conduit to the decision makers and how we leverage our capacity to influence them? Parisa.
I want to actually reiterate some of the points that I raised, and I think engineering education in terms of climate change is one thing, but we need the whole society to be educated. And right from a small kid to up to the higher education. And I can't agree more with Shemet that it's not just for engineers to have the sustainability competencies, but it should be across the board. Unless we have a knowledgeable society which is aware of the implications of climate change, we can't push the agenda forward. That's for sure. But if we bring it down to the engineers, if you look at, I make an analogy of the safety practices which are in place in the companies and industries these days, compared to 50 years ago. And you can see how industries have moved in terms of their safety practices. we probably can do the same thing with climate change and the same sort of cause and effect. And I think when it comes into safety, we had to educate our engineers, and not just engineers, but the managers and so on in the industries, that why is it a good idea to put firmer safety practices in place. And I think we can do the same thing. Yes, it might be quite a small steps, but I think as an engineering, if I have the knowledge, and also, sorry if I put it this way, if I have the guts to actually bring forward my way of thinking that this is not the right thing to do in terms of climate change, then we are making move forward.
Thank you.
Gratifying.
Yes, Anas.
I fully agree. The analogy is really good one, Parisa. Maybe we can take the analogy a little bit further and learn from the fact that when we started formalizing, and the example is for Australia, first phase of the harmonization of the safety, found that lots of companies spend enormous amount of money on near misses, on things that were not really all that high risk, if you will. So now we are in the second phase where we're examining whether those processes are, where are needed, and all those forms and all of that stuff. So if we go to the analogy of the climate change, we really don't want to go to that extreme where we become too cautious. And that's, people are seeing that in big infrastructure operation, where the boards, I told you earlier that the boards are becoming nervous because of their responsibilities. So they start rejecting designs, and that means that you're gonna have to spend lots of money and lots of effort to get projects through. And that's actually a risk, because the reason being is that the understanding, Shamit absolutely summarized it very well. So it is not just about knowing that we're dealing with a high risk issue. It's really about understanding the risk profile deeper, so that we can make the right decisions. And we shouldn't go all the way again to the cautious approach, which will cost lots of money, and then suddenly no project will get done, and then we'll swing back again. So, unpacking the risk profiles of climate change, that is the big piece that we have, that engineers can actually help people understanding really, because again, the 2.5 degrees here or there, it actually doesn't mean anything for someone in Geraldton or someone in Busselton or anywhere, because the impact can be completely different. So if you apply the same principles for the port of Geraldton, then you're gonna be spending like hundreds of millions of dollars for nothing, whereas you spend it more. So it has to be fit for purpose. I think that's where the work needs to be done. The IPCC report doesn't tell us what happens in our backyard. The IPCC gives us some sort of high-level information and encourage people to understand the local impacts and respond accurately and accordingly. That is, you can be dealing with a huge amount of costs.
Thank you. And that takes me to the theme of a couple of questions emerging, which is we're really looking at either end. We've got upcoming young engineers, and we're also talking about decision makers at board level. There's a large number of senior existing practicing engineers who've been there for a long time, and a couple of comments from people about what can be done in particular to lift their awareness and involve them in the process of actually addressing the problem. I wonder if Gillian, you'd like to start by commenting on that.
I would, thank you. It's such an important question, or range of questions. I think what I want to contribute here is that the currency of modern leadership is courage. And wherever you're at in your career, like if you're the newest of new graduate, or even beginning your study, or you've been in industry a long time, it doesn't matter where you are in that time frame. It takes courage to contribute your ideas. When you're younger, I think the fear is that you'll be wrong, that you'll be seen to be inexperienced and maybe foolish. When you're older, the fear of being wrong is even greater in some cases. You know, you may have years and years of experience where you've invested in having the best possible approach, but then of course the risk of not being heard or not being understood can sometimes be higher. But throughout the whole spectrum of our lives, the courage it takes to stand up and lead and risk the vulnerability it takes to make real and lasting change is the same for all of us. So I invite us to kind of, you know, really look for ourselves. Like some of the people that are listening to this and being with us today have got the conduit into the kinds of connections that could move these issues forward very quickly. So I'm not quite sure that fully answers your question. It was kind of meant more of as a challenge for action. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of the time. We've got 5 more minutes, and I'm interested in hearing from each of you quickly about the specific challenge of, just as to honour some other questions that have been coming through, getting influence into the political arena where shifts need to really be underwritten and supported. Shamet, Anas have hinted at this, interested in all of your perspectives on how we can close that gap so that engineers actually step into that accountability to both articulate and support the shift in thinking. Might go back to David. Start on that, David.
Okay, so we started off this idea of having this presentation on climate change with the hope that if we did more work on adaptation, it would show how expensive it will be to adapt to serious climate change, and then it would make mitigation look like a really good deal. So back to Anas's point about making this stuff local, I would hope that as a result of what we've been doing now, we do some more work and we look at what an adaptation level of 2.5 degrees or something else agreed would be around the whole of Australia, because that's the difficult one. But if we can show that, you know, we can talk about sea levels and Sydney Harbour specifically, sorry, Sydney Airport, then I think that that will be a very powerful message to our leaders.
Thank you. Shamet, would you care to comment on that as well?
Yeah, sure. A couple of points come to mind. The first is that all of this takes place at an enormously high level of abstraction. I mean, all the public attitudes evidence suggests that the great public of Australia and elsewhere are environmentally aware, but not necessarily signed up to the threat and the concern around climate change. They understand it's in the background, but they're essentially environmentally aware. We shouldn't over sort of claim where the public are. Second thing, of course, is that people live their lives through the stories they tell themselves. They don't necessarily pay attention to the evidence that's pouring out of universities like UW. I mean, that's not how society works, sadly, much to my regret, of course. And so if you ask a sort of practical question around what we can do around the table in this discussion and the audience as well, and in the context of opinion formers, I would say 2 things. One is, and I would say this, of course, make sure that universities have public policy institutes. I don't say that in a self-serving way, but
you do, and it's legitimate.
It never fails to surprise me the extent to which policymakers are really quite disconnected to the even translated and, you know, slick version of what we as academics and experts have to say. I spent, you know, most 30 years spending a lot of time in government and universities, and it keeps on crossing up. And the second thing is perhaps working with our colleagues ourselves on how we translate and communicate what we've got to say and how it addresses a particular policy problem or challenge of the moment. And I do think when you break down climate change and have particular localized impacts, which is what we've been talking about, I do think there's plenty of scope, particularly at state level in Australia, to have something to say about that. I mean, there's obviously a bit of work to be done before you can do that, because a failure to do that will result in us speaking at a very high level of abstraction, can't really work in my view, or being dragged into very specific concerns and worries, which actually our evidence doesn't necessarily support. So complicated way of saying that we need to get sophisticated. We need to have a very nuanced understanding of how policy works. And for goodness sake, not to be naive and just expecting research practitioners, policymakers, practitioners, and research users to be consuming what we're producing simply on the quality of the research that's been done. Life doesn't work like that, in my view. And we just need to be a bit smarter.
Need for an engagement to support it. And I'm conscious of our time there. So I'm going to thank all of the panelists and all of the people who submitted the questions. As I said, they will all be recorded and we'll use them to support a longer and deeper examination at a future event. Can I throw to John Dell from UWA to close for us, please?
Thank you, Doug. I think we've had a really great beginning to a discussion. There is a lot of things that have come out of here, and I think one of the two of the key things that I saw as being really important is recognizing that engineers need to talk to different disciplines, and the ability to do that is critical to the solution of this particular problem. I particularly liked Julian's point about the fact that we need to look at the adaptive approach rather than just the technical, and making sure that our engineers know that the solution is not just another desal plant. It's something that's much more holistic and will generate something that is new and great and will actually look at really solving the underlying problem. So let me just finish by saying thank you to Engineers Australia, thank you to the UWA Public Policy Institute. One particular vote of thanks goes to Laurie Jones from EA, from CLM. She's done a fantastic job in bringing this together. She's also the curator of questions, so we're not losing those questions. We've got them for the future activities that EA will be doing in this space. So thank you very much, everyone.